Plato ended up influencing, obviously, Aristotle, who created some more concrete scientific texts, which guided Western thinking for the next 1,500 years. So Socrates taught Plato, who taught Aristotle, and you get this moving from mythology into philosophy. And then the Romans, the great entrepreneurial warfighters that they were, realized that, wow, these Greeks really have this intellectual stuff figured out. Now, we can beat them on the battlefield, but if we want to create an enduring society, let's just take all the Greek mythology, rename the Roman gods Greek gods. Let's take their philosophy. So, all the great Roman philosophy actually grows out of Greek philosophy. They shamelessly stole it. Cicero, his classic text, De Republica, which Chris also had us read in this course, Chris Calenda, was actually a much more specific, okay, how do we take what Plato wrote from a philosophical level, where he talked about guardians and, wise kings and the promise and the perils of democracy, the rule of the mob. And Cicero said, well, what's a practical blueprint around which we can organize this? And this is actually how the Romans organized their government, a very brilliant form of government, the Roman Republic, where they had a Senate that was counterbalancing the power of the consuls. And then you had the plebeians and some basic democracy among the landowning classes, at least. And they had a very solid form of government until the empire comes about, and that was solid for different reasons. But the expansion of Rome was really built on a very practical application of these ideas that came from the Greek world. And all the educated Romans spoke Greek, and that was still the language of the intellectuals in the Greek world. And a very interesting thing happens during this time is the rise of Christianity. Now, I happen to know a bit about this subject if you listen to the first episode, because I grew up as the son of a Church of England minister. But when I went to Chris Calenda's class, I really understood why Christianity took off. And why Christianity took off, it was really struggling in the beginning. You had this historical religious character, Jesus, who died, and he had this fanatical band of followers. It was really struggling. In fact, they were being persecuted by the Romans, who viewed this as a threat. And the great break in Christianity was when this guy, Saul, actually gets converted on the road to Damascus to becoming an apostle. He becomes the Apostle Paul. He writes most of the New Testament in a series of letters. And why did Paul become the most influential apostle, even though he didn't know Jesus personally in his lifetime, is because Paul wrote in Koine Greek, and he was an intellectual. And he was able to translate very, very powerful ideas. Like Plato was not talking about the Greek gods. He was talking about one unifying idea, which was called logos, which was truth in Greek. And 1 John, the first chapter of John, most famous verses of the Bible, I remember my dad's favorite, is in the beginning was the Word. In English, that's what it says. But in Greek, it says, in the beginning was the logos. In the beginning was truth. The truth became God, and this whole Bible verse really is starting out the argument to the Greek intellectuals. What Plato said has now been manifested itself in flesh, and this is a continuation of your intellectual tradition, your philosophy. And that took off. And the educated classes started to read these letters by Paul. And this great viral movement started before Facebook shares, when it's really hard, is people started copying these letters of Paul and distribute them in the early church of Christianity. And for 300 years, Christians were persecuted in the Roman Empire, not allowed to be. They were burned at the stake, crucified upside down, put as entertainment in the Roman Colosseum. But it spread anyway, and it was the power of the ideas, which Paul wrote about, where he was speaking to the Greek intellectual class, but also the power really of stories. If you grew up in any way in the Christian tradition, like I did, and many people who are older can remember this, is Jesus told great stories. Hugely powerful stories, whether or not you believe in Christianity and all the dogma and the church, no one can deny that his stories are really powerful. I mean, you think about the prodigal son and all these other stories, and who cannot relate to these stories? They're universal. And that was really the power of Christianity, was the stories. And eventually Christianity becomes accepted in the Roman Empire as the Roman Empire is declining, and they actually embrace it because they realize this thing's not going away. It's so popular. And we're going to embrace it. And actually, that helped sustain the Roman Empire after a while for another couple hundred years when Constantine did embrace Christianity, because he latched onto something, rather than trying to suppress it, something that was very powerful and popular. And that gave credibility to a declining empire. And when Rome fell to the barbarians, officially it crumbled over a couple hundred years, but 476, when Rome was officially sacked and kind of given up on, the eastern part of the empire survived in Constantinople, which is now Istanbul in Turkey, focused on the Greek part of the Roman Empire. That idea of Christianity became, especially in Western Europe, the only force to organize things around. And the Pope became tremendously powerful. And as Europe fragmented into many different warring kingdoms, the Pope basically became kingmaker, and everyone had to pay homage to the Pope. And why did the Pope and the Catholic Church specifically, and obviously the Eastern Church had the same thing going on, but they had a more stable government. Why did these two churches, East and West, the Orthodox tradition and especially the Catholic tradition, become so powerful? It's because the church became the custodian of ideas. They became the storytellers in chief. And they weren't publishing news stories every day. They weren't thinking of new things to think about. They were just taking these great stories from Christianity, and what was the most influential position in the church, the most revered, the most looked up to, is the monks, the guys who go out and copy the Bible and keep that tradition alive over many centuries. I mean, information distribution was very, very hard. Most people were illiterate. To have the attention to detail and the literacy and the discipline to copy an entire book like the Bible and reproduce it with high fidelity without changing things was a huge undertaking. And because of that, the leaders of every community in Europe, the gatekeepers of the stories were the clergy. And all over Europe, these clergy have been educated in Latin, and they're reading these stories which have been translated. And the monks actually kept a lot of the original stories in Greek, and that was one of the things you needed to know: Latin, also Greek. And it was a huge industry. I mean, really, the Catholic Church was the world's greatest publishing house. And also in the Eastern Orthodox tradition in Greek also was the same thing. And I mentioned the Catholic Church because there was no political power in Western Europe compared to the Eastern Empire, which survived the fall of Rome. And it just became massively influential. That goes on, in ebbs and flows, obviously, from the fall of Rome up until the 15th century. And then you have this monk, a German monk named Martin Luther, who basically goes to war against the church. But Martin Luther was not the first monk to act up and say things are a little bit corrupt and we need to reform things. But what was different about Martin Luther versus some of the other ones that preceded to him who weren't successful was that the printing press had happened. Gutenberg in Germany had invented the printing press, and now the Catholic Church no longer has a monopoly on monks, who are the only printing press that existed for 1,000 years. And people can now take something like the Bible and reproduce it very, very quickly. And then more and more people are getting access. They start reading the Bible and they start saying, well, the ones that are literate saying, oh, wait a minute, what this says versus maybe what society is doing or is not necessarily congruent. And Martin Luther just basically used the fact that the gatekeeper, the first great disruption in information production since the written word had been established, and this industry around reproduction of the written word grown up around the church, they lost that monopoly. And that was the big disruption that causes a huge change in Western civilization. You get kingdoms that start to form national identities. For example, the King James Bible in England, still to this day revered as like the world's greatest language, as all the other translations of the Bible in English don't stand up to the King James Bible, and Shakespeare and the great way in which English was communicated during that period is still like stuff of legend in the English speaking world. Every child studies Shakespeare, who's really a product of that time when said, okay, this is what English means, because we're going to take the world's greatest stories and put it in our language. Same thing happens in Germany. I mean, German as a language gets established because that whole area of Europe was never politically unified. It was completely fragmented, and they get their own Bible. And then you get these different, and then the French do the same thing, and you get these different cultures that start to get this awareness around their own language, what they never had before, because the Bible's no longer in Latin, it's in their own language. And this causes a huge struggle. You have the CounterReformation, where the Catholic Church comes back and really reinvigorates its intellectual foundations. The Jesuits come in and they clean up some of the corruption in the church around some of the ideas where you can basically buy salvation through the Catholic Church, which basically gave the Catholic Church a lot of money. And they realize, okay, that's probably not good story to have out there about us. And they cleaned that up and really reinvigorated the ideas around which the church was originally founded, and got a little bit back to their roots of being a much more positive, less corrupt church, and pushed back, and Catholicism survived. And then you had the popes backing the Spanish king, the Habsburg king, who controls most of Spain and a lot of the Austrian Empire and parts of Netherlands now. Largest empire in Europe is Catholic Empire, and then you have these Protestant states fighting against it, and you have Sweden and England and the German states, half Protestant, half Catholic, and France has a large Protestant minority. So there's all kinds of war that happens between basically the middle of the 15th century all the way up until the start of the 1800s, until the beginning of the 19th century, that are all around religion. Kingdoms that are backed by the Protestants, that have broken away from the Catholic Church, and it's really this massive competition between what's the best ideas around which to organize society. And the printing press keeps fueling this, and a great example for the Americans who might be listening to this, or Brits who are don't have amnesia about this, is the American Revolution, which really grew up around the fact that printing press was like a blog. Everyone had one in their town, or the neighbors had one, and there were all these pamphlets coming out saying, hey, the way the Brits are ruling us over here in America is corrupt.